All right. Good evening. What time is it? Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Another episode on Relentless Pursuit of Purpose. Our vision, our goal here is to help everyone enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. And with that, make sure and hit the subscribe button if you've not already done so, and click the bell so that you never miss a video or an amazing interview like we have lined up for you tonight. Brother in Christ, awesome man of God, awesome apologist, Abdu Murray is joining me tonight, and he has just released a new book, More Than a White Man's Religion. I almost said it wrong. That's going to be a very different story. More Than a White Man's Religion. So we're going to get into a lot of it, but I was telling Abdu before, I mean, I read the whole thing and I've written all through the margins and underlined and highlighted. Plus I was listening on Audible as well. So I got other notes there. But it's a well done book. It's a necessary book. And so Abdu, thank you for being here. Thank you for writing this and welcome.
Oh, thank you, Alex. It's great to be back with you, and congratulations on this particular show. I was with you a couple of years ago, we're back when everyone had to become their own audio engineer because we were all on lockdown. I think it was when everything was happening,
Yeah.
And I was just in the middle of writing this thing. So
wow.
I love the fact that I was in the middle of writing something that now we get to talk about. So thanks for having me on. It's really an honor.
Yes, thank you so much. And actually, can you just catch everybody up with who you are and what you do? And
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Abdu Murray. My last name is not really Scottish; it's really Murray. But when we came over, I think that they basically changed it to a Scottish last name. But I'm a Lebanese guy, a former Muslim as well. I became a Christian in the year 2000 after a 9-year search into the historical, philosophical, scientific, theological, and existential underpinnings of various worldviews, including and especially Christianity, finding that it answered the toughest questions of the mind and the heart. I am a speaker and writer with Embrace the Truth, which is a apologetics ministry. It's really an evangelism ministry, but we use apologetics to do our evangelism, where our mission is to offer the credibility of the gospel to every questioner we encounter. And we believe that truth, when embraced, hence the sign back here, leads to freedom. And we endeavor to answer each person. I've often said it, Alex, and I know that on your show you try and strive to do the same thing, is emulate what the Apostle Paul says in Colossians 4, where he says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. We are not in the question answering business. We answer questions, but we really, honestly, we answer people, because questions don't need answers, but people do. So that's what we do. We try to answer people through the medium of their questions, and hopefully we do it with dignity and with respect, and as much humility as fallen human beings are capable of having.
Yeah, I love how you said that. Because we're what's the saying? I'm just one sinner trying to tell another sinner, where to find bread or where to.
Yeah, it's, absolutely.
Yes, man. So I don't think I knew the new name, but and this is not one of the questions. But so my organization is called Proof for the Truth, along the same lines. Because if there is no truth, then we don't need to be here. Right?
Yeah,
There's nothing to talk about, really. So I love that. So look, there's so much to get into, you all. And if you haven't read the book, please go get it. This is not going to give you everything tonight in an hour, a little over an hour. There's so much depth in here, and the footnotes are extensive as well. So make sure, or the endnotes. And so just make sure, go get the book. It's available on Amazon, Kindle, hardcover, everything. I think the only thing I don't have is the Kindle version. But I want to just, as we start out, I want to just frame why you wrote this book, why now, and kind of what was your goal? Because I think, some people, no matter what you do in life, they're going to be triggered when they see a title like that. It is what it is, but you got to get past the cover to really understand. And actually, I want to share a quote from that intro that you wrote, or part of it. And you said, many of the moral presuppositions with which we judge Christianity's failings arose from Christianity's victorious over the moral world in which it was blinded. Failure to accurately diagnose the root causes of the social ills that beset us would be especially harmful, perhaps even socially fatal, if we mislabeled as poison one of the medications that could actually lead to the cure. I think Christianity, more specifically, the Bible, has been mislabeled.
Hmm.
Awesome. So yeah, can you expound on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks, Alex. The reality is that as I've been on many college campuses and various secular universities and other secular settings, by the way,
Mm,
business and government and all these kind of things, and I've been blessed to be a part of those things. Terribly unqualified to be, but somehow God has put me in those positions at times. What I've noticed is something is that the questions have shifted over time. Most of the questions were primarily on truth-centered questions or more propositional or fact-based questions. What I mean
mhm,
by that is questions like history. Was David a real figure of history? Can we verify if the Exodus actually happened? Did Luke get certain facts right in the book of in Luke or in the book of Acts? These kinds of questions, and then
right.
questions about science and faith, and these kinds of questions and philosophical issues, to be sure. But what I've noticed is a lot of the questions have shifted away from primarily truth-based questions in terms of propositional truth to more
Mm,
moral truth questions. And those questions have become, isn't the Bible the white man's religion? And I think every part of that, in fact, the title to my book is really supposed to, every single word of that title was carefully chosen. It's
mm, yes.
more than a white or male religion.
Mm,
It's not those things, but it's
right.
more than just those things.
Yes.
Um, and so I began to see a shift where people were actually weren't asking primarily. They're still asking the truth-based questions in terms of proposition, but the primary questions were moral questions. Does the Bible promote slavery? Does it force a woman to marry her rapist? Is it sexist? Does it prohibit women from having any real standing or stature in society? And
Mm,
isn't it just full of judgmental hypocrites? These were moral questions. And so what I began to see was a shift away from questions like, is the Bible true, to is the Bible moral?
mm,
And those moral questions were centered on justice,
yeah.
equality, and most pointedly, with all of the issues that have happened and things that have arisen from Trayvon Martin to George Floyd and to
Mm,
all the things that happened before and everything that's happened in between and since, has been an issue on race. And with the politicization of Christian faith, and the polarization of society generally, um, this has become a very, very hot button triggering emotional issue. And
yeah.
and for good reason, by the way, not just because people get upset and get incendiary. These are issues that go to the heart of what it means to be a human being. And then, of course, with the rise of Me Too, and the lingering importance that that movement has, whether you agree with it or not, isn't the point. You cannot dispute it as that it is important.
Right.
Um, it became ever so much clearer to me that addressing these issues was important. And just if I can just, with a denouement to that first answer, I look to myself and say, well, why me? And I address this in the book, actually. I'm not white, but I am male. Uh, so why me? And one is because I come from an ethnic minority and I come from a formerly religious minority. But now I'm part of the so-called majority of people who would claim to be Christians. Whether that's going to be true anytime soon is another issue.
Mm,
But also, I come from a background, a Middle Eastern background. We're not known for our, vaunting of women.
yeah.
Although it's funny, I was taught to respect women at a young age, and so, but I also have an insider perspective because I was born and raised in the United States.
Mm,
So, I think what I hope to bring is some level of an insider outsider perspective and say, what is this all about?
yeah.
So the passion in me was to write this book because I think these are the questions the culture answers. And if I asks, sorry, and if I go back to Paul and what he says in Colossians 4 is walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. In other words, answer the questions the culture is actually asking, not the
Mm,
ones you hope they ask. So
yeah.
we have to get to the truth questions. But the reality is that our answers are drowned out by the cacophony of the moral questions. And they're not bad questions, they're just the more urgent questions right now. But that could change. And hopefully
Yeah.
that will. But right now, we have to address the culture where it's at.
Well said. And as you were talking, I was thinking, a new thought was that in some way aren't the, I mean, I know the people who are asking the questions wouldn't necessarily frame it this way, but in some ways, and even as you kind of work it out, the answers in your book,
Mhm.
aren't the moral questions also fact based in a way? Because the fact is, the
Mhm.
Bible does not condone slavery or does not condone sexism or anything like. And you made that case very clear.
Mhm.
But it's weird, isn't it, that these moral truths do have a ontological attachment to something real, right?
Absolutely, they're anchored in that. What a great observation, Alex. In fact, if I were to blend, shamelessly plug 2 books at the same time, Saving Truth was all about a post-truth culture where people where feelings and preferences matter more than facts and
Mhm.
truth. They're not completely divorced from it, but they matter more. And
Yeah.
so I think, one danger to addressing only the moral questions devoid of factual anchoring is that they become preferential questions, and that's all they
Mm,
become. They become emotive questions. Rather, you take the questions of race and gender issues and equality seriously if they're anchored in truth. So there's 2
mm,
parts of the truth that we have to do, and I hopefully, respectfully, and honestly tackle a couple of things. This is not a political social commentary book. This
right.
is this is a biblically based book that says one question is the Bible the cause of or the solution to these issues? So we
Mm,
have to be serious about some facts. One of those facts is that Christendom does not have a absolutely unblemished record, not
right.
even close, when it comes to the equality of both racial minorities and women. We don't have that, but the Bible was misused in order to perpetuate those inequalities and those heinous acts of the past. But we can't sugarcoat the heinous acts of the past because we think that somehow Christendom is the same thing as Christ or as the
Mm,
Bible. So if you're right, the facts are the Bible doesn't condone these things, and I make an argument that it actually regulates them out of existence if it's properly applied.
mhm,
But the fact also is that people's hurts and what they've gone through and what they currently wrestle with is not done in a vacuum. It's not just because you've been fed something. There
mm,
is a history here we have to be honest about. Is some of it, you know, can we say some of it's like maybe not actually the case in particular instances? Sure, but we also have to realize there are real hurts with a real history here and a real contemporary reality too. So it has to be based in fact. So you're
right.
quite right to link the two. You can't have a moral judgment without a factual basis upon which to judge that moral basis.
Great. Yeah. That's very well said. And so that draws me to the conversation with the young African American guy that you referenced throughout many of the chapters. And it's kind of like this running dialogue throughout the book.
Hmm.
And there was one part, well, there's a lot of parts, but the part that I'm going to talk about,
Hmm.
let me see if I got this right. You said, oh, I think you were talking about Chris Brooks, who gave this analogy about the
Yeah.
spouses. And
Yeah.
he said the wounded spouse needs to process the hurt in order to move on, but the spouse in the wrong isn't trying to escape responsibility, but is trying to make things right as a means of taking responsibility. And that kind of gets lost in the culture and the conversation sometimes. Probably even some people reading your book is going to get lost in them,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so how do you kind of give us guidance to navigate that type of situation?
Yeah, and, that was a particularly poignant thing. I remember we were on a panel together addressing race and faith issues. Chris Brooks, a wonderful African American pastor here in the Detroit, Michigan area, good
Mhm.
friend of mine. I know you know him as well, and a real statesman for this kind of thing. And he made that, point as a pastor is that often in marriages, you'll have the spouse who was wronged and the spouse who did the wronging, sometimes be at an impasse because the wronged spouse wants to go over the issues and the trauma to deal with the pain of the past, and the spouse who did the wronging wants to just make it better, not only for him or herself, but also for the person that they've wronged. And so I think that the important thing here is um, that in order for that marriage to succeed and proceed beyond to the point of reconciliation, the we have to be willing to be vulnerable to hear the wrong that was done by us,
Yeah.
but we also have to be willing to accept the attempt to make it better by the other party. So one party might dwell on the past too much and not ever seem like they
Right.
want to move forward. And the other party might not dwell on the past at all and seem like they don't want to acknowledge the hurt. And then maybe if we say, not in every conversation, because sometimes you're just right that the person just wants to sweep it under the rug, or the other person just wants you to pay for it forever. We have to, when it comes to the racial and the gender inequality issues that we have to wrestle with, we have to be willing to listen to both the hurt and the solution. And if
Mm,
you're not there, then more counseling is needed, and I think more reconciliation. And there's experts who can help us with these kind of things. But I
Yes.
think that that's an important insight, and I'm extremely indebted to Chris Brooks for that insight. And he applied it to the issues at that time only of racial issues, but it equally applies to the gender issues we face today.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it stuck out to me just probably like it did to you. So that was
Hmm.
it's a good analogy.
Hmm.
So let's push into some of the thornier issues now.
Hmm.
Um, what is Pentecost? So I remember I was so this was last year or 2 years ago, but it was during the pandemic at some point. I was giving a talk in Charlotte, and there's
Hmm.
a church, there's a predominantly black church. They were merging with a predominantly white church, and it was going well, and it had been going even before the pandemic. But anyway, during this time, I came in, I was giving a talk on building a multi-ethnic leadership or something like that.
Yeah.
But in the research, I did a lot of research on that, the day of Pentecost, and I remember making a list of all the nations that were represented there, um, which kind of blew my mind. But what does Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, I should say, teach us about how God values ethnic diversity?
Yeah, and you can say, what does the day of Pentecost, as actually described in the book of Acts, teach us? But the day of Pentecost, generally speaking, so what the book of Acts describes is something that was actually precedent to the book of Acts.
Mm,
People from various areas of the Middle East and Europe and Africa would come into Judea and go to Jerusalem and go to Israel in order to celebrate Pentecost, which is 50 days after the Passover. And you had people of various ethnic backgrounds, all of whom spoke different languages, a lot of them bumping into each other, trying to make a way in a very crowded place to observe a religious thing that actually binded them together, despite. And I would say, not even despite, but actually because of their ethnic diversity, it
mm,
made for a wonderful experience. So you already had a religious observance in the Bible, and based on biblical principles and first century Judaism, which actually encouraged people of different faiths to come together into one place for a single purpose. And
mm.
different, not only, sorry, not different faiths, different ethnicities. I
Ethnicity, yeah.
didn't mean different faiths, but
Right.
different ethnicities. So you have this coming together. What the Bible describes in the book of Acts is people from Mesopotamia, that's well into Asia, the Middle East, well into Asia. You have people from Asia Minor. You have people from the Israel area, the heart of the Middle East, in terms of the Levant, but also North Africa and Europe. Um, and the one description, this is sort of near and dear to my heart, is the Bible goes out of its way to point out that there are Arabs there.
Mm,
And amongst with the Jews. And if you can't find a more ethnically similar in terms of actual Israel, uh, yet uh, politically against each other group than those two, and yet the
mm,
Bible specifically points out that Arabs were there
yeah,
at Pentecost. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is that God blesses the disciples with this ability to speak in other tongues. Now, it's not the kind of tongues where people speak in a sort of a spiritual language that no one can quite understand because it
right.
doesn't sound like any earthly language. No, in this particular instance, the gospel message at the very time of the birth of the Christian faith. Okay, this is mere weeks after Jesus dies on the cross and rises from the dead, according to the scriptures, where the one of the most ethnically diverse times of the year for the Jewish faith. This is when God chooses to make the most public declaration of the gospel after Jesus's death, and he does it not by having everyone suddenly miraculously speak Hebrew. This is critically important, Alex.
Yes.
People don't miraculously speak Hebrew or
Right.
Greek, the lingua franca of the time. No, the disciples are speaking probably in their own language, but everyone's hearing their own language. So the Arabs and the Medes and the Parthians and the Edomites and the residents of Mesopotamia and the Romans and the Africans, they're all hearing in their own language. In other words, God is blessing their ethnic diversity. He didn't say, "Here, I want you to suddenly speak Hebrew." He said, "I want you to hear me in your tongue."
Yeah.
That is a remarkable statement. They had the phrase. This is terribly ironic and actually quite poetic.
Yeah.
They have the phrase actions speak louder than words.
Mhm.
So if my words are just, oh, the Bible values ethnicity, and I just say that, or God just says it, no, God put his money where his mouth was,
Yeah.
quite literally using his mouth through the disciples to actually speak to every single person. So words are empty, actions mean something. But here's what's interesting is God used action in a
Mm.
miracle to make words across the ethnicities matter. That's a
Wow.
fundamental respect for ethnic diversity.
Wow, that's awesome. I love how you said that. It reminds me of John Lennox talking about, isn't it interesting that the word is in the beginning, and
Mm.
words not just matter to God, it is God in many ways.
Yeah,
So yeah,
indeed.
that is very well said.
Mm.
Now, the crux of the book obviously deals with racism, but you deal actually a lot with sexism. So I can't even really say it's just one or the other,
Mhm.
um, which I think is important because there's so much talk about one or the other, but
Yeah.
if we're going to say the gospel is the solution, it has to solve all the problems.
Yeah.
And I think as you show it does. Now, I want to switch the conversation to a little bit of understanding women's involvement, especially in the early days of Christianity. And I
Yeah.
think in the book, I think it's in this book,
Mhm.
Michael Kruger, you have a quote. He's talking about how early Christians were mocked for being so pro women because there were so many of them,
Yeah.
uh, which I think is really interesting that for people to know. And I'll say, like, I am so tired of talking about is Christianity white man's religion because it's just on repeat in my brain or people asking me or so it's tiring.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, at this point, probably for you to some extent as well. But I think what's not maybe um kind of talked about as much is not just how the Bible affirms ethnicity, but how it affirms the both sexes through the entirety of Scripture. And so, what can we learn from women's involvement in those, especially in those early days of Christianity?
Yeah. So you're right, is that Michael Kruger does point out that the early church was mocked by the Romans as the religion of women and children because it was peopled populated by women and children primarily. They were actually rushing to it. Now,
Yeah.
you got to think about this. Why would women and children, women specifically, because the children probably followed those
Mhm.
women, but why would women leave a perfectly woman affirming religion like various paganisms of their time to go and head to a sexist religion like Christianity? No, what they did was they left the incredibly sexist um, property making, um, commoditizing views of the paganism to Christianity because they saw the opposite in the Christian message. First of all, that started at the life of Jesus himself, and it extended into the life of the apostles, and of course, that extended into the life of the church fathers, and that extended into the life of the church universal as it spread both east and west, and south and north, and all the places it did go. So that's why it was being mocked like that. And so the early Christian women knew this was a religion, this was a system of belief, this was a message that affirmed their value. Otherwise, they wouldn't have flocked to it. But then you look at the actual. So I'm going to do a sort of a reverse time
Yeah.
travel where we're going to go backwards in time, starting from sort of an ancient time, of course, the first century. You see a couple of things. You see Paul. Here's an interesting little thing people don't realize. People want to say Paul, didn't like women because he told women to be silent. And there's things you can respond to, and I do in detail in the book on that. But here's an interesting thing. Paul lists women many times in the scriptures as those who were among the faithful, amongst those who were the supporters of the early church and were actually teachers of other people in the early church. And then he has this really interesting thing. And this is why the scripture, and I'm thinking about writing an entire book on this just by itself, is the way the Bible uniquely defends itself. Um,
Mm.
Paul lists when he talks about two people in specific as pillars of the early church. He lists Priscilla and Aquila, a husband and wife. Typically, whenever you list a husband and a wife team or a father-daughter team or whatever it is, you list the father first or the husband first because that's the sort of way you did it back then. So it should have been Aquila and Priscilla, but he didn't do that, and that was not a mistake. He did that on purpose. He listed Priscilla first because of the primacy with which she did so much in the early church. He honored her, and everyone who was reading his letter would have known it, that he honored her in an odd way, which was it stood out. Not odd in the sense that it was not a good honoring way. It was that
Yeah.
it was odd in that it stood out so much. Then go further back, and you see and there's this wonderful story in the Bible. Just give an example of this. One of my favorites now. That when I read it over and over again, I see something so beautiful and genuine and specific in it. Is the story of Mary and Martha. You know, you have the story of Mary and Martha, where they're Lazarus' sisters, and Jesus and his disciples are coming to a gathering at their home. And like good Middle Easterners, they want to make sure that everything is ready and there's food coming out of everybody's ears. So they're preparing the house. Now, we know the story of Mary and Martha because Martha, typically how it's preached is Martha is busy doing all the busy preparation work, and Mary is sitting at at Jesus's feet, almost as if it was an excuse to get out of work, as it were. And Martha gets upset and says, Jesus, don't you care that Mary's not helping me? Tell her to come help me and all this. And Jesus says, Martha, Mary's chosen this, and you're worried about so many things, and you shouldn't be worried about that many things. In other words, it's trying to give women, like, because they worry so much about so many things, they would take care of so many things and do things right. He's saying, just calm down. And so we hear the message usually is, don't let your busyness get in the way of a profound teaching like Jesus might offer you and a
Yeah.
spiritual nourishment. And that's a good, valid point. But here's the point I make in the book. There's actually more to it than that. See, what's going on is Martha is so acculturated. She's so used to being put in her place. She's told by the leading rabbis, she's told by the rabbis of her day, and I quote them over and over again, outside of the Bible, about how women weren't allowed an education. It'd be better to teach, to bury the law of God than to teach it to a woman. And women have no, women don't have any sense. Women don't have any skill except with the spindle, and all these things. And so she's used to that. She's used to the kitchen being her place.
Mm.
And so and this is a phenomenon that's gone on through the centuries, by the way. When women entered the workforce in the 70s and 80s in traditional male jobs, they were often acculturated to, well, you got to put up with the boy talk, and you got to put up with the terrible behavior. And even
Yeah.
when another woman would come in, they would be so grateful that that new woman would get the brunt of the awful behavior, and they'd
Yeah.
be relieved of it to a certain degree. And of course, they would later on form their solidarities. But Martha is sitting here in a culture that puts her in her place, and a place that that never allowed a woman to sit at a rabbi's feet. Sitting at a rabbi's feet was an honor for a male. It was an
Yeah.
honor. And here's Mary sitting at his feet. And then when she finally complains, Martha, that Mary's not helping, she says, Jesus, don't you care that she left me to do all the work? Tell her to come help me. In other words, put her in the kitchen, put her in her place. That's how bad it
Yeah.
was for women then. And Jesus, in his inimitable way, says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about so many things, but only one thing is needful. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. In other
Mhm.
words, not even by you.
Wow.
Wake up, wake up. You have been deprived too long, and you're too used to this now, Martha. Mary's a good example. She's getting an education, and you deserve one too. And that's just one example of the many. And then if I can just pause for a moment and go back even further in time
Mhm.
into the Old Testament, the book that everyone thinks is just terribly misogynistic.
Yeah.
You have entire books of the Bible who are named after women, where women are the heroes of the story. And you look at the book of Esther as one example. Of course, the book of Ruth, where Ruth is a Moabite. So you have ethnic and gender issues in that book. And she's the grandmother of David, and she goes into the lineage of the Messiah himself. And in fact, she's mentioned by name in the
Yeah.
New Testament, in the genealogy of Jesus, which wasn't a thing that women were actually given opportunity to be a part of. And then the book of Esther. Esther is a hero. But
Yeah.
what's really interesting is Vashti. Vashti
Mm.
is a character. She's a Persian, a non-Jew, who is treated like a trophy wife in
Mm.
the beginning of the story by
Yeah.
the king of Persia. And she refuses to be his trophy. She refuses. She makes a protest. I will not come and be paraded around like some trophy for you and your friends to ogle. That's an interesting thing. Why include that in there at all? Why
Mm.
not just say, there's this woman named Vashti, she's no longer queen, and they needed a replacement, and Esther became the replacement queen.
Yeah.
No, the Bible goes out of its way, I would argue, to point out that Vashti was a woman of character and courage, and
Mm.
she's a non-Jewish woman. what an interesting thing to include in this story. And I could go on and on about examples in the Bible where women are treated terribly, and it's never condoned. That's the important thing. It's
Right.
never condoned, but women are honored. Deborah was appointed by God to be a judge among the judges, like
Yeah.
Samson and these folks. So you see plenty of ways in which women were vaunted, not only in early church, but even before that. And so what we see, why women were flocking to the Christian faith, is because from its leaves to its roots, the Christian faith vaunted the value of women.
Wow, I love that. From its leaves to its roots.
Mm-hmm.
That's deep right there. I love it. So in the book, I think when you're referencing, no, it's before you're referencing, I think, the Sam Harris kind of theories, but you
Mhm.
talk about this thing, the miracle motif.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people will, not necessarily know what that means, but let me see if I have this quote here. I think put this on the screen.
Mhm.
No, I don't have it. Okay, so I'll read it. So there's a part in here that says, it simply isn't true that common belief automatically leads to the pursuit of the common good. And that's actually going to lead to my next question. But can you just first explain what is the miracle motif,
Sure.
and where do you think it leads us? Does it fail? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so the miracle motif is it's a phrase that's used to basically not criticize in a bad way, but just to point out a sort of deficiency in the way we approach racial issues, gender equality issues as well. And it's basically this: is that let's not talk about these issues, let's not dwell on these issues. Instead, let's preach the gospel as if that's somehow divorced from
Right.
universal human equality. But let's just preach the gospel. And if people's hearts and minds are inclined towards the gospel, which says that God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever, regardless of skin color, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of language, regardless of gender, shall be saved, and all that kind of stuff, right? So the miracle motif is the idea that if people just believe the gospel, that while I do believe, and I personally believe in the miraculous regeneration of Christians through the Holy Spirit, it's a process, it's a sanctification process, and plenty of Christians have fallen short on this as we progress in our Christian faith. But the miracle motif basically says people will stop being racist, people will stop being sexist if they just believe this gospel message. And I point out that the miracle motif is the idea that a miraculous thing will happen. Society will just get better the more Christians we have. And of course, historically speaking, again, anchoring things in fact, I would love for that to be the case. I would love nothing
Right.
more than for that to be the case. It's not the case.
Right.
Some of the paragons of Christian theological thinking have been slave owners. No one's going to argue to me that they didn't understand the Bible. Esau Macaulay pointed this out. That look, you can't say that people who fully understood the Bible, properly understood, would have led to lack of slavery or lack of racial prejudice. That's not true, because people who fully understood the Bible still exhibited it. There's still a human heart issue. So what I'm trying to, and I didn't coin the phrase miracle motif, by the way, others did,
Mhm.
but I think I understand the frustration with the miracle motif is that if you just preach this message, things will just change. I believe fundamentally that the gospel, believing in the gospel and its philosophical foundation, the gospel message is I think the only message that actually makes sense of why we're outraged at racism, why we're outraged at sexism. I think a naturalistic paradigm and I think other religious systems don't actually adequately address it. So what I point out is that believing the gospel, or at least the gospel taking root in society in some influential way, is a necessary condition to real change, even though it's not sufficient. What do I mean by that? And please, I'm going to get a lot of people saying the gospel is not sufficient. No. The gospel is sufficient for our salvation. The gospel is sufficient in so many ways. Absolutely. Notice what I said. It's not the gospel message that's insufficient. It's that we don't actually put action to our faith. And
Right.
that's the issue, is that belief has to lead to action. And then we have both a necessary and a sufficient condition. If the gospel doesn't motivate you to do something, then you need to re-examine the strength and the core sort of what your belief is all about and ask God to help you with that. So mere assent, and people can assent all they want. They can say, I'm a Christian and I believe this and that and all that kind of stuff. And you can become dangerously close to what Dallas Willard called a vampire Christian, someone who wants who wants Jesus just for his blood.
Yeah.
But Jesus commands us as Christians to not only make him Savior, but also Lord, which means you have to do what he says and follow his example. And then when you look time and time again, belief should inspire action, and action should bolster belief. So that's what I mean by this, is that the gospel is a necessary, just believing the gospel is a necessary condition, but the sufficient condition is acting it out, living it out in not only our individual lives, but in society.
Yeah, absolutely. You're speaking my language now, because I've been talking so much over these last 3 years about orthopraxy for that
Yeah.
very reason, that I have been annoyed, as you kind of illustrated the miracle motif, and I didn't have that terminology, but the whole just preach the
Mhm.
gospel, it's on deaf ears at this point, because if there's not action behind it, words don't physically change people's condition of poverty or pain or suffering. Words are nice, but you need money if you're poor. So
Mhm.
orthodoxy can never be divorced from orthopraxy. And
Absolutely.
you're absolutely right that we in the church, now forget the world for a second, that's an us issue that we have to get better at.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can do it. Here's the interesting thing. We don't have to agree with everyone's assessment of every issue,
Right.
whether it's race or gender. Just take stock of and be self-reflective on things and realize, and this is the interesting part of it, is that as a Christian, I believe that I'm a sinner in need of a savior. I also believe in sanctification. I don't believe that once I became a Christian, that every single issue I've ever dealt with is suddenly magically gone, or that my faculties are completely cured and that I'll never botch it again.
Right.
Or maybe even don't even have issues and hangups that I have to have. Least of all people, we should be the ones who think that. We don't believe in our perfection. We believe in his perfection that sanctifies us over time. And so that requires us to have self-reflection. Does it require us to self-flagellate constantly? No. But does it require some self-reflection? You bet. And action proceeding from that self-reflection. I think that's
Yeah.
the key.
Oh, absolutely. Amen to all that. I was teaching in jail earlier today. So I do that a couple times a month.
Mm,
And we have this workbook we're going through, and it's called Walking the Walk, but it's specifically for the brothers in there. But in the end, I was asking, like, we were talking about unity. I was like, what are some ways that we can remain unified, especially you all in here? I know it's a totally different environment. I feel for you. We're praying for you, but it's necessary, because it can literally be life or death for you in there. And
yeah.
then the other component is, what does unity? I've been coming back to this high priestly prayer so many times, because
Mm,
Jesus, they say deathbed confessions matter. The last words on the earth they matter, right?
mhm.
Jesus could have prayed for anything the night before his execution. He could have prayed that every church would blow up and get all these members and whatever. But he prayed that we would have unity. Like, that was it. That was his prayer for us.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that eludes us because of a lot of the issues that you wrote about in the book. And it's just
Mm,
one of the brothers in there, he said, yeah, we have to remain humble. And I'm like, man, this is a brother incarcerated teaching me, teaching a lesson that people on the outside need to hear, essentially.
yeah. Absolutely.
Which
This
just,
is totally. I'm sorry if this is
oh
somewhat
no.
off topic, but it does have to do with the transformational power of the gospel. I was at Angola prison a few
Mm,
years ago. It used to be one of the most violent, if not
yeah,
the most violent, prison in the state penitentiary system
yeah,
in the United States. And then the warden Burl Cain introduced Bibles into cells, and he introduced various seminaries within the prison walls, and things changed quite a bit. We
mm,
visited there, and we preached the gospel, and there were folks who didn't believe and folks who did believe. I visited. This is an interesting thing, Alex. I visited the hospice unit. They have a
mm.
hospice unit
Wow.
because Louisiana has some of the toughest sentencing laws. I think that there's some real serious change going on there, which is for a good thing. It's some of
Yeah.
the toughest sentencing laws. So I think it's something like 78% or something like that, some super high number of the people at Angola are there for life and without parole. They will never get out, which
Wow.
means a large number of them are going to die of some kind of a disease like cancer or Lou Gehrig's or something like that. And so you have this hospice unit. And what's interesting is the number of prisoners that actually volunteer to be a part of the hospice unit. Now,
Mm.
this is interesting because they're in there for life, not for some kind of a, like possession of cocaine or something. They're in there for life usually because of some form of murder or
Yeah.
some lesser charge like manslaughter. So here's the thing that I observed. Here are a bunch of people who are in prison because they so hastily thought little of life that they were willing to take a life on an instant's notice.
Yeah.
And now they're so transformed by the gospel message that they want to help someone end their life with dignity and will patiently work with someone for weeks and months and maybe even years as their life drains from them. That's a transformational power. I think that is a miracle. And so I don't want to dismiss the miracle motif completely, but that's a miracle attached to action.
Yes.
I think that's the kind of thing we can expand to all areas of life. The Christian faith, Mark Twain once said that that history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And he's right. Is that
Yeah.
I think Christians have put their faith to action. The abolitionist movement, the women's
Yeah.
suffrage movement, all these various things have been led by Christians as well. And we can see history repeating again because Christians are looking at, poverty issues, the hospital movement that we wouldn't have hospitals if it weren't modern hospitals, if it wasn't for Christians. We
Right.
have a great reason to believe that this message does cause change, but we have to be willing to be a part of that change as well. So I'll stop talking about that necessarily, but I think it's an important part of what the whole point is.
No, I appreciate that, and whatever you want to say, feel free. Don't feel like you got to hold anything back.
Yep.
So I want to get into this next question, and I'm going
Yes,
to
sir.
set this up so we all kind of get on the same page. So in this other section of the book, I mean, it had to be done, right? We gotta talk about CRT, and these things come up.
Mhm.
So let me say one thing. I feel like I've been on repeat for saying that obviously racism is a real thing, right? I think well, I can't even say that anymore. A lot of people understand it's a real thing.
Yeah.
um, and so one thing I said is there's been a huge backlash in certain parts of the Christian church, but to me it's a red herring because let's take the SBC for example, the denomination.
Mhm.
Took 150 years to apologize for slavery. Took
Mhm.
1 year to make a statement on CRT.
Mhm.
Those scales don't seem balanced.
Mhm.
So, and I can't put this on everybody, but it seems like whenever there's a potential to lose power, this is when people get louder,
Mhm.
even as they're denying that they have that power,
Mhm.
which is part of the irony. So I always say CRT is a theory addressing or looking at analyzing something, a real thing, but it overswings the pendulum.
Mhm.
And I think you actually at one point you talked about oh man, you said how putting emphasis on this aspect or this fact, and that's how we get these two camps that they
Yeah.
overemphasize this thing and they overemphasize this thing. And there's elements, like you said, of truth in both sides,
Mhm.
but it's not totalizing.
Mhm.
And so let me put this quote, and then I want to where is it? Not that quote. So in analyzing Kendi, and for those who don't know, Ibram Kendi is a prominent CRT writer. He
Mhm.
said this theme runs through his entire analysis, culminating ultimately in his proposed solution to racism, which is that we don't need to change people's hearts and minds first. We need to change policy first, and the rest will follow.
Mhm.
And so then the other aspect in my mind is one other aspect, like for example, as an African American man living in America, I fully believe that the ultimate solution, obviously, is God changing hearts and minds. But then there's a part of me that's like, yeah, but I don't got time to wait for people's hearts and minds to change. So, so can we do something to make us safe while we wait on that?
Yeah.
That's kind of the and I do understand the other side of, well, we don't want to just legalize and just put law on top of law on top of law, because then that's unlivable and it's just
Mhm.
going to piss off the other side, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the easiest way for me to say this is I think it's a both and solution. And I feel like you in this book are providing, it's not either or.
Mhm.
And so you, Abdu, are kind of like the and to the Ibram Kendi thought process,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the last thing I'll say is, we got to remember, for example, like facts. that everyone sees. And now the thing is everyone has a camera, everyone has a cell phone. So it's not that stuff's really new. It's just everyone can see it now. And
Yeah.
so one thing I've told people is like most bad police interactions don't end with the person dying, which
Mhm.
also means no one knows about it except
Mhm.
that person or whoever they tell. And every bad police interaction I've had, I survived. Obviously, I'm here. And
Mhm.
so it doesn't mean those things didn't happen. It just didn't thankfully go the way of George Floyd. And so I think the other thing, not addressing in your book, but just for everyone else, is that we can also get lulled into the change that's happening, whether we agree with CRT or this theory or that theory or whatever. But the other part we got to remember is that these changes and these theories and this stuff is not just happening on its own. And if there were no video evidence, who's to say it would be happening at all?
Mhm.
And so the hard part then is like, okay, so what if there were no cell phone cameras? Would we even be talking about social change, let alone heart change? Do you see what I'm
Mhm.
saying? And
Yeah.
so I want people to not miss what you're saying, but I also want people to not miss the other totalizing perspective. So let me get your thoughts on all of that. I said,
Yeah. 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 Thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. And I definitely feel, obviously, as you say, the interactions you've had, um, uh, and this really touches me because I know that there are other folks who've had a similar experience. I've only had a couple of points in my life where I can actually say directly that I've been denigrated or made to feel inferior in some way because of my ethnicity. And I actually point out one of those particular things
yeah, the
in the
pizza
book.
parlor.
But yeah, the pizza parlor episode. And there's a couple of other times that's happened, and I don't go dwell in them. It's only a sliver. It's only a mere taste. And I'll tell you what, whenever I drive past that place, it's not very often, but it's still by my house, and or it's in the town 2 towns over now from where it happened. I can never forget what happened there. Um,
Yeah,
so I can only imagine what if someone experiences even one bad run-in, what flashing lights behind you feels like after that. So I don't want to overstate the case, but I don't want to understate it either because it's really important. The section I wrote, and it's not very long, on CRT, I wrote numerous times, and I had some
mm,
good friends join in, people who
yeah,
had, I think, some critical things to say about CRT, but also some not proponents of it, but people who were like, okay, I want to be a little more
yeah,
circumspect about it.
yeah,
Our good friend Brandon Cleaver, for
yeah,
example, was instrumental in helping me with that section of the book, as
yes,
well as a few others as well. Um, so here's what I want to point out is I think that we have to understand. So if the downside to CRT is that the pendular swing the other way has been everything is about race.
right,
Um, and the pendular swing in reaction to it is that nothing is about
right,
race. Well, that can't be true. That's just
right,
simply not true. Neither one of those is true.
right,
And I don't want to do an escapist third wayism kind of a thing, but I do think that there is a truth that we need to go right in between here and say that what CRT fails in, I think, is that in some ways it doesn't go far enough.
mm,
Is that CRT doesn't actually place the problem with the human heart. It places it with structures and societies. Well, those structures in society, well, those structures only exist, good or bad, because of human beings. It's not like these structures fall out of the sky, or we have a instruction manual and we build this thing like a Lego system. We don't know what's going to look like at the end, but suddenly, oh, that's what it looks like. This
yeah,
is based on hearts and minds. And yes, there is a gradual historical development of some of these things, and some people don't even realize they're a part of a system that does certain things. And so they wake up to it and they want to seek change. But CRT doesn't go far enough in one sense because it doesn't actually point out what the Bible points out is that the human heart is the heart of the matter,
yes,
and so we have that shortcoming. However, I think that it's important to one of the ways in which, and I quote Kimberly Crenshaw in the book, is that she points out that race, for example, is a social construction. Couldn't agree more with that. By the way, the
absolutely,
Bible agrees with this. The Bible
yes,
never uses the word race. It never
thank
makes
you,
any distinctions based on race anywhere in the Bible. It does make distinctions, I shouldn't say distinctions. It does call people by ethnicities, and it
Hmm.
does make judgments. God does make judgments and uses the labels of those ethnicities to do that. But and I have to pause for just a moment here, because what the Bible does is it basically says God judges people based on their actions. So the Amalekites or the Canaanites, or you name the group, even the Israelites, by the way, are judged fairly harshly for their actions. And what I think is important here is that, to point out something, God never judges anybody by the color of their skin, but by
Hmm.
the content of their character. That sounds familiar.
Yes.
And I do wonder, it's not hard to see the connection that Dr. King made between a biblical view of justice and the civil rights movement itself. So I think that's important for us to understand. Now, why I say all of that is because we can't make everything about this, because what Kimberly Crenshaw does is she says, look, race has been used as a social construction to keep people down and to actually enslave them. And it's empowering to take it back. Black is beautiful and these
Mhm.
kind of things and all. It's empowering to take it back. And of course it is. Of course it's empowering.
Right.
But when it becomes everything about you, it
Mm.
actually it actually becomes reductionistic. So
Yes.
that you become an African American male. I become a Middle Eastern male. My friend becomes a white male, and all this stuff. And that becomes the primary thing about us. This is why all this talk, I think, in one sense, I get why they're doing it, but talk about blackness, whiteness, and all these things in terms of the completely different lived experiences can have a carving effect. It starts to carve
Mm.
us up a little too much. And so to me, what I see happening is we have to embrace the reality of our ethnicities as valuable, God honoring things. Because look, Alex, you're not incidentally African American. You are
Yeah.
purposefully African
Mm.
American. I am not incidentally Middle Eastern. I am purposefully made that way. My white friends are purposely white. God
Yes.
intended it that way. And at the end of the age, when everything is made right, we will lay down from various tribes, tongues, nations, and all these things with our various mosaic of colors. We'll lay our crowns down at the feet of Christ. Heaven will not be gray. Heaven will be a
Yes.
mosaic of beauty and color. So race is not nothing, or ethnicity is not nothing. Ethnicity is something important. But here's what I want to get to. I think CRT makes race everything, which means that
Great.
it becomes definitional,
Yes.
and that's reductionistic,
Yes.
because it's based in humanism. And I think Ibram X. Kendi's problem or issue that I have with him, among several, one of those is he bases it on a humanistic framework: is that structures are racist and people can be racist when they follow racist policies and structures. But he's not saying people are inherently racist, which gets rid of the sin condition. We
Mm.
actually are sinful.
Yeah.
Um, uh, However, at the same time, we're losing that, because race reduces us to simple people of, we happen to be genetic machines of different varieties. That that lessens us
Mm.
to what we truly are. So what I would say is this, and I point this out: race, or I should say ethnicity, because I think race. I get the term, and I'm fine using the term. I think it's less helpful than ethnicity, but
Yeah.
if it's a social construct, then the irony here is that Kimberly Crenshaw took a social construct, and she still believes that, but then she uses it to actually make it definitional, which means it no longer is a construct anymore. It's actually ontological. Um,
That's a
so
really good
here's
point. Yeah.
yeah, so here's what I would say. And I get why she wants to do that. I get why people in CRT want to do that. I totally get it. Here's what I would say, that where it falls short is ethnicity is a blessing of the expression of who we are. Being made in God's image is a definition of what we are. And if we can
Mm.
take those two things and not conflate them, not make race definitional, but make the image of God definitional,
Yeah.
and race is an expression of what it means for you, Alex, and for me, Abdu, and for Kimberly Crenshaw to express the image of God that he has placed on us, then I think we can actually see it in its proper place and begin to say, you know what? This is terribly important, but it's not all important. How do we actually value someone's expression as a particular ethnicity without making it so much definition that we carve up the world into these various tribes and divide ourselves? Unity. You pointed it out, Alex. I want to come right back to that. The reason why Christ prayed for unity is because we are all made in God's image, and the world will know. And this is the most important thing Christians can hear, I think, of
Yeah.
anything I say today. Anything I say is that the greatest witness, I'm an apologist, the greatest argument we can ever give, and I realize it's not a philosophical argument, but the greatest thing that we can do as Christians, according to Christ, was the world will know that the Father has sent the Son by our unity and our
Yeah.
love for one another. So we don't have to be uniform, but we can be unified.
Yes, absolutely. Well said on all that. Listen, y'all, if you came in late, please go back and rewatch, not right now, but later. Because there's been so much heaviness dropped. I want to say one last thing on this, and it's not really a pushback, it's just another thought.
Mhm.
So like I was talking with a friend up near you, actually, not Brandon, but somebody, and environments have effects on people, right?
Sure.
Environments in some ways often shape hearts, and people are sometimes products of their environment. And so then there's that, and then there's also obviously the conglomerate, like you said. Actually, I was talking to Jim Warner Wallace back a few years ago in training,
Mhm.
and he made the point about this is way before all the recent police stuff, but when we were talking back, I think 2016 even, and he was like, look, the only group that God can choose from, or that can be chosen from, to work in any system, politics, education, police, whatever, are humans. And as you said, the only thing that exists on this planet are fallen ones. So
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
you know, the fact that a few sinful make it into each system shouldn't be surprising.
Right.
And so we're not, and we know the hearts need to change. But the other part about it is, like, a person can be racist, but a person can't create racism.
Mhm.
That takes a systemic level thing to happen, or to, like, slavery was a systemic um law. It was not a person thing. It was all of them agreed, right?
It was an
And
institution.
so
It's literally an institution.
literally, right? And so and we can go down the list of all the other atrocities we've done to each other in the history of the world.
Yeah.
So the other side, I don't think, I think, to your point, CRT is not necessary,
Mhm.
because if we get the gospel right, it takes care of everything else.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we just need to teach Christians how to get the gospel right. Maybe
Mhm.
that's the place we need to go. But understanding there's this both end of, we want to change the individual hearts within all of these different systems, all the way up to the president, if possible, not us,
Mhm.
but God. But the systems are some of the systems are imbued with either components or residue components of racism or racist past that have sort of been taken out. But even the effects, like, let's talk about redlining. Okay, it's not legal anymore, but it still happens. I saw articles. So in practice, the vestiges of the entrenched racism or legal racism is still present. And so there's part of me that's thinking, okay, we got to somehow get the racism out of the systems, which I don't know how we do it. I don't know if we'll ever do it. So I don't expect you to answer that. But
Yeah.
while simultaneously preaching the gospel to those people, especially in positions of power. And
Mhm.
actually, this is the last thing I'll say. There was a pastor a long time ago, and he said, somebody came to him and asked one of his members and said, should I take this job at the casino? And to the guy's surprise, the pastor said, absolutely. But the reason he said yes is, he said, wherever people are, God needs a representative there.
Mm.
And if there's not Christians in these different systems who understand fully the gospel, who have true heart changes, really they're the ones in position to change the system from within.
Mhm.
And so there's there's 3 or 4 layers I just laid out of components, one of
Yeah.
which is obviously the individual heart change. Then somehow, I don't know, there's a systemic kind of rooting out of things. And then there's Christians getting into these systems and infiltrating from within. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Like,
Yeah, yeah, I
there's
think
all of those kind
yeah.
of working.
Yeah, absolutely, and without at the risk of not becoming a social sort of political commentary,
Yes, please.
because and I'm not saying you're pushing me there. It's just the book is more of a foundational. Don't throw the cure out just because there's poison
Absolutely.
out there that's been used in its name. I think that your point though is well taken in the sense that what we have to realize, and by the way, I certainly don't want to give the impression, and I think, I appreciate your comment that what Jay Warner said, look, you're going to have some sinful people in all these institutions. And so there are officers out there who are doing a wonderful job and who are trying
Yes,
their very best and risking their lives every
absolutely.
single day. They
Most
deserve
of
our
them.
prayer. Yeah, and they deserve our prayers and support as well. And so we don't want to be heard as not saying that.
Yes.
Um, the thing that I think is important that you're pointing out is, and this goes right back to a comment you made that I think is so important that we can't stop on, is because, or we should pause for just a moment on, is whereas Kendi would say, let's change policy and then hearts and minds
Right.
follow. Hearts and minds are those who make the policies.
True.
And we have plenty of laws on the books that if we actually listen to those laws, we'd actually start to see, oh, that's a thing that doesn't comport with the spirit of this law or the letter of this law. And so that change in my local sphere needs to conform to what we had already enacted in the 1960s, and then
Yes.
redone in some refinement in decades since. What I'm getting at is that hearts and minds influence policies, but policies do influence hearts and minds. So I don't even think it's a both and. I think it's a both and in a way that's cyclical, that one
Mm,
feeds the other. It's much like the idea of energy, and they have the phrase a vicious cycle,
mhm.
where you do this and then that creates this and then that
Yeah.
creates more of this, which creates more of this. This is actually the inverse, the photo negative of vicious cycle, which is
Mm.
a victorious cycle, where we actually can see hearts and minds changing so that policy changes, so that hearts and minds change, so that more policy changes,
Mm.
or not even policy, just practice. Because you
Yeah.
can have less policy, but better practice, and you don't need more laws. You just need people who actually follow those laws, and
Right.
they'll follow them through hearts and minds change. I mean, look, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all these things. These are great. These are good. We just
Yes.
have to basically follow them.
Yeah.
But how do you get people to follow them is that heart and mind change. So I think I've often said it this way. I think sometimes when people are half right, they become all wrong. And in
Mm.
one sense, I would say that Kendi is half right, which makes him all wrong, because I
Yes.
appreciate what he's trying to get done. And I have, like I said, I have some pretty serious disagreement with a lot of what he says.
Me too, by
But
the way.
there's, but there's, yeah, and there's some pretty serious, I think some flaws in some of the things. But I think also there's some things we need to understand. If we inject the gospel into that situation,
Mm.
I think the outcome's different.
I definitely agree. And for those who are tuning in, just so we're clear, this is not a disagreement. It's actually augmenting the argument that's already been made. And in the book, Abdu makes all these things much more clear. We don't have time to really,
Yeah.
parse out every word for word. So please go get the book and understand that it's dealt with. But at the end of the day, there's one solution,
Mm,
and that which you said before is the key to the book.
mhm.
That we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The very thing, like you said, that people are complaining about is the thing that they need to solve the problem that they're complaining about.
Yeah,
So well
absolutely.
said.
Yeah, I just go right back to C.S. Lewis. I think not, sorry, not C.S. Lewis. Blaise Pascal,
Mhm.
where he points out that he's taking a look at humanity, and he's saying what a chimera is man. What a contradiction. What a monster. Yet an imbecile worm. Yet glory of all creation. We are horribly immoral. Yet we're made a little lower than the angels.
Mm.
And we have this thing going on, and all you need to do is look at society and look at each individual human and then the collection of humans together to realize that's absolutely true. He does not get that by mere observation. He gets that from the pages of scripture. And
Yeah.
so scripture realistically diagnoses the problem and then offers us a solution to that very problem. All of the social theories and the whole section on the various social theories is called Theory Without Theos. If you don't
Yes.
have the
That was a great
theos.
title, by the way.
Oh, thanks, thanks. When you don't have theos, your theories are going to be deficient
Yeah.
and misguided and misplaced, and then you're going to isolate people.
Yeah.
But an inclusive theory that includes the gospel, but it includes the fundamental heart of what it means to be equal, I think that's helpful.
Absolutely. I'm not gonna put this question up, but Mr. Dwayne, let me just address this very, very quickly because I want to make sure we stay on track. We're not sticking up for Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, the doctrine. Just we're not
Mhm.
affirming those things. We're simply calling those sin issues done, yes, in a large or systemic way. But there's a deeper purpose to the book that Abdu wrote, which is to say the fervor that has tried to eject the gospel or Christianity from everything is actually cutting its own feet out from under it, if I can say it that way, right? That
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. We're and the analogy I give in the beginning of the book is the social surge. You
mm,
know, we have this, and I saw this documentary with of these trains in India, where people are by the thousands thronging to get onto this train just to get to work, and they're willing to get on top of the train if it means risking their life just to get to work because they have no other
yeah,
way to get there. Well, some poor soul's trying to get off this train, and 1,000 people, like a river of humanity, coming at him, and he can't get off the train.
yeah,
And what I'm arguing in the book is that despite the shortcomings of theological giants, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily moral giants, but because they're fallen human beings too, and they are products of their time in some ways too. Um, Despite that, and even because of that, we have this surge that runs away from Christianity. It's getting on the trains that speed away from the Christian message. What I'm suggesting is that maybe, like that one guy, we should think about, should I get off the train now? Maybe I should actually see whether this message actually gets me to the right
mm,
place, where it's saying, no, people of different ethnicities are in fact equal, and women are in fact equal to men, despite the shortcomings of various people. Look, the Bible is realistic about this. This is what I love about this.
me
If you look
too.
at the
Yeah,
yeah, you look at the characters, and I actually don't like referring to biblical people as characters because it suggests that they're part of fiction. The figures in the Bible, the historical figures, they have blemishes. They have bad blemishes,
yeah,
yet God still uses them. And so, what I would say is, in contradistinction to the figures of the Bible, or in contrast in terms of degree to the figures of the Bible, but also the figures of history, George Whitefield and other folks,
yeah,
where you have an understanding of, and even good actions coupled with their Christian faith, you have some serious blind spots. And I don't mean to pejoratively say blind spots are just a small thing you got to worry about. I think blind
right.
spots are ask any new driver about blind spots and how devastating they can be, and they'll tell you. Jesus is the one to whom we conform our behavior, not
Yes,
our favorite theologian and not
yes,
our favorite speaker or our favorite figure of history. No,
yes,
Jesus is the one, because not only is he the source of this gospel message, but he lived it out perfectly. So
mm,
we can use him as the straight line by which all of us bent lines are trying to configure ourselves. He is the plumb line that we have to configure our bent lives to. And so I hope we're not condoning any bad behavior, nor are we throwing
no,
people out as if they
no,
shouldn't be listened to just because of some serious character issues in their
yes,
lives. This is just the way people are, but the
absolutely.
message is still the same. Anyway, sorry about the
No, no, no.
diatribe there, but it's
I
important.
think I appreciate that because we need a robust. These are thorny issues, and I don't want people to
Yeah,
leave thinking we said something we didn't say or meant something we didn't mean. So no, please
yeah,
be
yeah,
clear. Clarity is always good.
yeah, absolutely.
So let's shift gears a minute. And you mentioned theories devoid of the gospel and not working. Um, I think most people are familiar with Sam Harris, or
Hmm.
most people who are into apologetics are, and he's really, they call the four horsemen or three horsemen now, I guess.
Yeah.
But he's really the only one that deals with trying to objectively affirm morality from a naturalistic framework, and he tries hard, but
Hmm.
it's there's some
Yeah.
uh there's some major issues. And so I love what you said in there. So you wrote that transcendent moral values only exist if they're grounded in a transcendent moral person.
Yeah.
um One issue, I say this thing a lot, that um naturalism, one of my main issues is not that it doesn't provide great answers, it can't even justify asking the questions.
Yeah.
And like that's a lot of scientific stuff that we can get to lead up to that, but
Mhm.
in this very logical sense, is there any way to have a moral truth if there's not a moral person behind it?
Right. Yeah, and this is an important distinction too, because oftentimes people will say that, or hear us as saying, "Look, you can't be anti-racist or you can't be against racism if you're a naturalist. I don't believe that. I believe there's plenty of people who believe in human equality and don't believe in God. The argument has never been, do you need to believe in God to be moral? The argument has been, does God's existence, is it necessary for there to be morality at all? Or are we just fooling ourselves?
Right.
And so the reason why that's important is because the shifting sands of human opinion, the vicissitudes of human opinion are just, look, it was not that long ago that it was legal to own people in this country.
Right.
Um, it was wrong when it was legal, and it's wrong now. Just because human beings, most people thought it was okay, doesn't mean that that's okay.
Right.
So it was objectively wrong, and our moral sort of faculties being impaired doesn't change that. Just like my vision is not perfect, it's getting worse and worse as the years go on. Does that mean that the visible light spectrum doesn't exist just because I can't see it? No, I don't
Mm.
create the visible light spectrum. My eyes don't do that; they just detect it. So uh, our outrage about inequality is only justified if there is a transcendent moral framework, and moral frameworks are not just out there. I mean, Plato tried this. Plato tried this with the Platonic idea of the
Yeah.
forms, that
Forms.
goodness just exists, that justice just exists, and all this stuff. But the big problem is that if goodness just exists, then goodness itself doesn't actually do anything good, which means that goodness violates itself because goodness as a concept is effete. It does nothing. It's like the number seven. The number seven can't change my mind. The number seven doesn't bump into me. The number seven doesn't obligate me to do anything. And so goodness doesn't do those things either. Things aren't good. Concepts aren't good. They can be good for you, but
Yes.
they have to be rooted in a person.
Right.
And I think that's where Harris falls short. And in fact, the conversation with the young African American guy, extraordinarily thoughtful guy, one of the most genteel discussions on an incendiary topic I've ever had.
Wow.
And he was well read and he knew his stuff. And we had a wonderful conversation. But it got down to this. He was a big Sam Harris guy.
Mm.
And it got down to, I don't see how you can possibly justify your outrage. You know, Sam Harris doesn't believe in free will.
Right.
He has a whole book called Free Will where he argues we don't have any. And I always wonder, did he choose to write that book?
Right.
It's just a weird thing to think through. But if that's the case, then we're just automata. And if I'm a racist, it's just because I'm programmed to be that way, and I need to be deprogrammed. But why should I? What is the oughtness? What is the obligation that requires my deprogramming? Because
Mm.
if I could argue that one set of people's subjugation benefits my set of people, well, then that's my programming. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And so racism in that sense doesn't even exist
Right.
if we're just biological chemical machines. My Apple computer is not, racist or computerist towards someone else's Dell. I
Right.
mean, just because they're different shapes, sizes, and colors, there's no moral attachment to those things at all. Just because we have higher cognition doesn't do that. So
Right.
we had this really wonderful conversation. We got to the heart of it right there, and it was a big issue. He really actually saw that. He saw that, and it really went to an important part of the conversation. And a short while later, I got this wonderful note from him that he was really exploring these things and was now joining Bible studies at a church. So
Wow.
I think that these conversations they're long and they're hard conversations, but they're always worth it. Even if the person doesn't come to faith, even through for years, they're always worth it because I think we can point to the beauty of Jesus. Now, I've gone on for a while now, but Sam Harris's arguments, he tries to justify that certain things are the moral peaks. Like we just know he's a consequentialist. Essentially, is that which is moral is that which is conducive to human flourishing, and the greatest number of people flourishing is what we should achieve, and that which isn't conducive to flourishing is immoral, and we can
Right.
judge this scientifically. The problem is that you've made an assumption is that human beings are valuable at all.
Mm.
And that's an assumption being made. You need to justify that assumption.
Especially from a naturalistic framework.
Absolutely,
Why are we
100%.
different than dogs or grass?
Right. And in fact, Lawrence Krauss would say we're completely irrelevant. If the world exploded tomorrow, the universe would go on as is. If
Mm.
humans were gone tomorrow, most of the species on this planet would continue, would persist. Some would argue even flourish.
Yeah.
So why is our flourishing more important than the H1N1 virus
Mm,
or than that of blue whales. Um, you're just assuming that.
mhm,
The Bible doesn't give you an assumption. It grounds us. It grounds our
mhm,
value in the necessary being, the being without which existence doesn't even happen. God is the seat of all existence. He is the source of all of existence. And if he says, this is not arbitrary, this is not a capricious, he is the source of all reality, which means that reality itself is determined by that source, which means that moral reality is determined by that. So when he
mhm,
says you and I are made in his image and are therefore infinitely valuable, that's true based on his existence. And there's great reasons to believe in his existence. But if he doesn't exist, then that's just a matter of fashion.
mm. Wow. Well said. One even tangential issue, and I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how frustrated you get if you're like me. So sometimes talking with naturalists or atheists, maybe it's just the YouTube ones, but there's not a lot of the terms are nebulous, right?
Mhm.
They can't ground anything, they can't define anything because there's not really a place in that worldview to define certain things. How do you define the moral law without that person, right?
Mhm.
But the other thing, even to say human flourishing, I have an idea what that means. You have an idea. I don't know if it's Sam Harris's idea. And so, how do you ground flourishing? What would flourishing look like? How
Yeah.
many people have to flourish to be considered human flourish? You see what I'm saying? Like it's
Yeah, it becomes a sliding scale, and it
yeah,
still goes back down to a now, Stan would say, I say Sam like I know it, like we're buddies or something. Dr. Harris would say, that, we can scientifically measure this, or we're getting better at measuring it.
right.
My problem with that is that you just hit it right on the head, is that what is there a utility marker? Is there a flourishing point? And how many points and what constitutes a point in the first place?
Right.
And by the way, and he points out, it's interesting in footnote 50 of his book, The Moral Landscape, he actually references what's called the value problem. And he talks about the thing called utility monsters. A utility
Mhm,
monster is some being who gets a utility out of your suffering. So
mhm,
we, for example, derive clothes and food from cows. So we are their utility monster. If we're
mhm,
their utility monster, that means that even if cows, because they're lesser formed than us, even if cows suddenly realize their plight, they would have no moral standing to object to our using them, because
mhm,
our well-being, based on some arbitrary nature of us being higher beings, in terms of our intellect, suddenly could use them. Well, what if aliens came from a far more advanced society, and their only way they can survive is to eat human beings? We
yeah,
would have no moral right to say you shouldn't do that, and that just seems inherently wrong.
yeah,
So, I think that that's where a lot of this goes off the rails, and you can't define these things; they become nebulous because you're constantly looking for human beings to be the source of that. That's what humanism is.
yeah.
Is this as human beings are Protagoras said it centuries ago when he said, "Man is the measure of all things." Well, if that's the case, we're in very serious trouble.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Mhm,
Um, Now you've touched on this, so you don't have to go into too much detail, but I just love this quote, so I'm gonna put it up anyway.
mhm,
Godly love transcends ethnicity while embracing it.
mm,
That was
yeah.
really good. So can you just expound on what you were
Yeah.
thinking?
Yeah, absolutely, and this goes right to the heart of what I was saying about that, God's image is what defines us, and our ethnicity is what gives us expression.
Mm,
Um, Godly love, when you look at the whole of the corpus of Scripture, when you look at the way, there was no favoritism, God didn't even favor his chosen people over
mhm,
other people. When they did morally bad things, he used other people from other ethnicities to judge the Israelites. So
right.
no one can say that he favored them in a sense that was an undue prejudice toward them or against other people. So you see that happening. Then you see actually God's care. I mean, you look at the story of not Nona, Jonah and the
Yeah.
Ninevites. Um, and this just goes right to the heart of the beauty of the scripture. So whether Jonah wrote the book of Jonah isn't the point, but let's assume someone wrote it about Jonah, and Jonah is a historical figure because of his references elsewhere. Um, and if he did write it, it's even more incredible that he doesn't come out smelling like a rose at the end of this book.
No.
He resists God's call to preach to the Ninevites because he wants only the Israelites to be saved, and the Ninevites can be damned for all he cares. In fact, he doesn't like that God is going to be merciful toward the Ninevites if they would but repent and they hear this message. So he runs in the complete opposite direction away from Nineveh. And so he wants to run to Tarshish through Joppa, and he goes to Joppa to leave. This is interesting because he considers the Ninevites unclean, and he hates that God considers them valuable enough to receive his mercy.
Hmm.
Peter, fast forward centuries now, Peter the apostle, after Christ's resurrection, has a vision where a sheet is rolled down, and basically this vision leads to the conclusion that all people, regardless of whether they're Jews or not, are valued by God, and the gospel should be preached to them. They are included and can be included in the kingdom of God. And you know where he receives that revelation? He receives it in Joppa.
Hmm.
That is poetic. So Jonah runs away from the idea of a God valuing people of different ethnicities. Peter embraces it in Joppa. So you see this poetic riveting of one particular place. It's almost like the Bible's making a point here to say, what is our attitude? Is it that of Jonah or is it that of Peter? And so godly love transcends ethnicity, that all people of ethnicities are loved, and he embraces it. In other words, you're not defined by your ethnicity, but God loves your variety. He loves the mosaic of color. He loves the mosaic of language. He loves the mosaic of food and the bouquet that are his people. So I think this is really important.
Absolutely. No, thank you for clarifying that. And I love how you said it. There's so many good lines in here. And I think at the end of that section, you said something about, because they were making a comment about everything in common. You're like, we're not common. And I think there's something, this is a whole nother show, but I think human exceptionalism is, to me, more pronounced than ever. Like, I don't see any naturalistic way forward of denying it, although I guess some have to maintain that position. But it's interesting that only humans, not animals, are making these arguments. But anyway.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because even on the emotional side of things, it's only humans who think about what the rings of Saturn are made of. It's only humans that want to know, that invent the Webb telescope, so that we can see further and further into the universe and find out about our origins.
Right.
That provides us with no evolutionary advantage,
right,
whatsoever.
Right.
Apes and other animals sit around and they don't think about these things, and they flourish just fine. What is it about us that is imbued with something of wonder? And that's a side issue, but it's an important issue.
It is. And I think it goes straight to the value issue. And actually, I just got a couple more questions, and one of them is in relation to value in some shade. So the entire Bible's professions about women from Genesis onward exist, as you show, in contradistinction to those surrounding narratives in the ancient Near East culture.
Yeah.
While also affirming the value of women today. Now, I think that second part is obviously where people are missing the connection of today. But even in the Bible, if we're going to read it properly and culturally and understand a high context culture and all these different things, can you talk a little bit about the Bible's affirmation of the value of women, especially in contradistinction to the other cultures in the area?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an important point here, because in the ancient Near East, women were often treated as the property of their fathers, which is why often women couldn't get a divorce. And if there were certain things that happened, that a man who was marrying a woman, or a man who wasn't even marrying a woman, but like raped a woman or whatever, he owed a debt to her father. Women in other, like whether it's Roman or it's ancient Near East, Mesopotamian religions or regions, the law codes didn't allow any sort of divorce in any really meaningful way. I'm not saying divorce is a good thing. My point is that women were subjected to their abusers without any recourse whatsoever. And men could, but here's the point: men could abuse them all they wanted, and they could divorce them all they wanted. And what you have in the Bible is a realization of the harsh realities of the ancient Near East, and the fact that at that point, because of the economic situations and various things, that women would be subjected to quite a bit of hardship that would be awful for them. unless they were protected in some ways by laws that restricted the abilities of males to do certain things. So while freedoms were given to women, in the biblical record, we actually see, and I go through some detail in this in the book, where men's behaviors are actually restricted in such a way that they couldn't do the things that would require someone to be a remedy for it in the first place. So they were actually
Right.
prohibited from doing some of these things in the first place. Um, uh, One of the authors I quote, Hurley, points out that while the Bible doesn't specifically say that it prohibits women's promiscuity, it doesn't say men can't be promiscuous. It leaves them no candidates with whom to be promiscuous with.
Mhm.
And so it does actually regulate their behavior in an equal footing with women. And what I try to point out too in the Bible, sorry, the book, is that the Bible has some uh, regulations and some laws that deal with women that might at first, to our modern sensibilities, without devoid of a historical context, seem a little on the harsh side. But you got to realize the Bible is actually regulating behavior that the people needed to be regulated then, at the moment. You don't have a suffrage movement. You don't have voting rights. There's no one to vote for heaven's sake. So you don't have those issues coming up in the Bible back then. But the principles that were laid down in the Bible, in the Old Testament, compared to the ancient Near East, apply in the future to our day today. But the Bible had to deal with the contemporary issues that were going on to address women's plights back then,
Right.
but also to address what happens now. So a good example, and I'll be really quick about this. A
Mhm.
quick example is the common misconception that women were required to marry their rapists.
Mm.
That's not actually what the Bible speaks on. In fact, it leaves quite a bit of the rapist, however, was required to financially support the woman he just plundered,
Mhm.
because the reality was she was unlikely to get married again after having this. And that's an ugly reality, but it's just
Yeah.
part of the reality. The Bible doesn't shy away from reality. It actually says we have to deal with the reality as it is.
Yeah.
And the woman, um, and so if there is a marriage that happens, and she's not required to marry the man, by the way, um, but if she so chooses, he's required to marry her. And what that means is, and she never has to live with the man. She can live with her father. She can live with her family. She never has to live with this man at all. What it requires is that he financially support her for the
Mm.
rest of his life. So I would actually say for the rest of her life, actually.
Yeah.
Um, so it doesn't enslave her to this man. Rather, it binds him to take care of the person he's actually plundered. And that's
Yeah.
just one example of a contemporary reality of the time, but then the equality message that actually pertains over and over again. Because if she was someone in the ancient Near Eastern surrounding regions, her rape would be nothing. And
Yeah.
it does not mean nothing in the Bible.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. It actually reminds me too, and you talked about this in the book as well. But we talk a lot about Ebed, and it's I won't say a bad translation, but it doesn't fully import the totality of what's in that word in the Hebrew.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, in fact,
so,
my name is Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages derived from the same thing. Abed can mean servant, or it can mean slave, and it can be even mean slave in a good way. Like my
mm,
name is an honorific. My name Abdu is a form of the word Abed or Abid, which is the plural, which means servant. And Abdu simply means slave or servant, or his servant or his slave. So when you have the name Abdullah in Arabic, that
mm,
means literally slave of or servant of God. So it's
mm,
not considered a bad thing. It's considered a good thing in some senses. There are actually
yeah,
names of prophets like Obadiah and Obed, whose names are derived from this word. So it's not always slave in a bad sense. It can mean a lot of words that have equivocal meanings.
absolutely, absolutely. And even Paul, I think in half his letters, he calls himself a bondservant at the beginning of Christ, which could be
Hmm.
considered slave. But I think even the people, even that young African American man or others that may be listening that aren't necessarily reading the scripture for themselves, and I'm not saying he wasn't, but
Hmm.
um, they don't read about the year of Jubilee and about the laws of how to treat slaves and 7 years and this and that. And one way, I mean, employer employee is maybe too simplistic, but the other part, like you said, the culture. Let's think about there were no, hey, I'm gonna go apply for a job at McDonald's and make a living until I can get a better job. There, that didn't exist. You had to
Right.
work for a person or for that the. So we have to also understand the culture, there weren't businesses lined up hiring and signs and stuff like that. And so in
No.
order to survive, you would submit to somebody who had resources that could help you survive.
Yeah.
That's more in line with what the Bible talks about, not transatlantic slave trade.
Well, and this is the important part here is that with our modern sensibilities and actually our recent emergence from some horrible institutions that are slavery. In fact, slavery exists today. The sex industry, sex trafficking, etc., amongst other things. There's labor slavery still going on to this day.
Yep.
So we have not gotten past this, which actually goes to show you that the human heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it?
Yes.
Which is why we need the gospel. Here's what I'd say is though, so when you read the word slave, it has a very bam, lightning rod emotional reaction because this word is a very charged word. And rightfully so. I get why that is.
Yeah.
But then you read it in the Bible and you see something. When we see the word slave, we automatically want to say, we naturally think to our most recent past and we think slavery, whenever it's used, must mean
Mhm.
chattel race-based slavery, like in the transatlantic slave trade. Um, it doesn't always mean that.
Right.
It doesn't always mean even chattel slavery, and it's certainly not race-based. In fact, slavery in the Bible, in the Old Testament and in the New, has nothing to do with race. It literally has nothing to do with it whatsoever.
Right.
So its racist elements were not unfortunate, an abominable, but relatively recent addition to it, which is why race is a social construct, because you use race to justify slavery because they're not really human. That's the whole point of the race, that you divide up the human species into various hierarchies of race in order to subjugate some and make yourself feel better. And that's a terrible thing to do, but we did it. That's what
Yeah.
history's about. The Bible doesn't do that, though. The Bible actually regulates indentured servitude, which is, as you pointed out, in order to pay off your debts, you have to work for someone, and that person is called a master or an adon. When you look at the Bible's regulations of this, you begin to see some really important things. First, you can't kidnap people to do it.
Mhm.
They have to do it voluntarily.
Yes.
Every jubilee, every 7 years, regardless if the debt is paid off or not, the bond servant is required to be set free of their debt. Year of jubilee, every 50 years. If
Mhm.
you've been a bond servant for all of 10 minutes and jubilee
Mhm.
comes around, you're free
Yep.
of that debt. So it's not about enslaving you forever. In fact, it's about trying to get rid of that. And I point out in the book some of the regulations in the Bible which prohibit the kidnapping of anyone to make them your slave, which prohibits the beating of slaves, certainly prohibits the killing of them, and encourages people to not return runaway slaves from other who are actual slaves or indentured servants, which is such a difference from the runaway slave law of the antebellum South. I mean, you had the
Yeah.
exact opposite of that. So it's not the same thing, even remotely close to it. In fact, here's one thing, and without getting sort of running the risk of making a statement one way or the other about the issue of reparations, I'm not arguing this or that about it. Here's my point. The Bible actually talks about when the bondservant goes free, when his debt is done, that bondservant is to be given from his master, his specific master, of the master's property, of the
Mhm.
master's cattle, and money. Why? So that the bondservant doesn't walk out and get right into debt again with
Right.
someone else. It's meant to end the practice of bond servitude. So
Yeah.
it regulates itself out of existence. Had we done that, had we actually followed the biblical principle during Reconstruction,
Hmm.
I think we wouldn't be having this debate right now at all.
Agreed.
So the
Absolutely.
Bible would actually solve the debates we're having right now. Now, again, this doesn't mean you can use the Bible to justify reparations or not reparations. That's not my point. My point is that um, a biblical principle here is not of chattel slavery at all. And if I could just close with a quote far more eloquent than anything I've ever written,
Mm.
and your listeners and your viewers probably are familiar enough. But if I think you can't be familiar enough with Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
You really should be. If you're not, you should be. And if you are, keep going. Um, he pointed out the difference here is that
Mhm.
Christianity that justifies slavery is no Christianity at all.
Yep.
And he says that between the Christianity of this land, meaning slaveholding, antebellum Southern America, and the
Mhm.
Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. Here's what he says: I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. He's pointing out something. The slavers were calling the women-whipping, slave-holding, partial views Christianity when Douglas recognized that is not what I see the life of Jesus.
Amen. I had to pull it up real quick. It's a great quote. Y'all can go look at this, screenshot it later. But yeah, that stuck with me just like it stuck with you, but for the same reasons that,
Mhm.
you know, especially when he's writing it, it's
Yeah,
not the safest time.
right, exactly, so anyway, everyone do yourself the favor of reading Frederick Douglass's stuff.
Absolutely.
If you haven't, please do.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's close on this one question. Actually, somebody had a question, if you can clarify. I don't know
Sure.
if you can or if it's in the book. So they were wondering, um, here, let me pull it up. So
Mhm.
the woman who was married to her rapist husband, would she not have to sleep with her husband ever again? Or basically, where is this information, or how can they kind of?
Yeah, so it's in the book specifically, and there's no indication that the woman has to sleep with her husband or even be in the same house with him ever again. There's no requirement for that. See, I think we infuse that into the meaning because she's not required to marry him, by the way. But if she does marry him, she obligates him to take care of her for the rest of her life. And the reality was, she was not therefore barred from marrying somebody else. Of course, being married to one person means you can't be polygamous and married to other people. Um, but the reality was she probably was never gonna get married again,
Mhm.
and that robs her of something
Yeah.
amongst the many things that rape robs her of. So in order to mitigate the robbery because, of the hardness of men's hearts, they wouldn't marry someone who has been raped, although it's
Yeah.
possible, but it's unlikely. She's not there's no requirement that she live with the man. There's no requirement that she sleep with the man. None of that. All that's required is that he has to take care of her for the
Yeah.
rest of his life. So it's not her being bonded to something. It's him being bonded to something based on what he's done to her. So I'm trying to look up specifically the reference in the Bible. I'm gonna look it up real quick and see if I can find it. I probably can't,
Okay.
but that is a excellent reason for you to buy my book,
It is.
because it is in there. I apologize. I wish I could
It
give
is
it to
in
you
there, y'all. And
offhand.
and look, there's footnotes everywhere. So the source is attached somewhere in the book to the footnote. You can go look it up. Um, but yeah, that's definitely in there. And I want to close on this, that
Mhm,
you talked at the end about these charismatic figures throughout history that reference or are influenced by Jesus.
mhm,
Um, and the essential question is, what does that fact tell us about Jesus? Even in Jim Wallace's latest book, Person of Interest, there's a part in there where he kind of did this deep dive of the world and through
mhm.
art and literature and music and finding Jesus and all these things. But the interesting thing is, if you look at those religions that predate even Christianity, they kind of update their religion or include Jesus in it later. And obviously, the ones that come after Christianity, they already incorporate him, even if they don't do it right, like the
Mhm.
Quran. But he's everybody wants to talk about Jesus in some way, shape, or form. They want him on their side. And I always
Mhm.
joke that people don't really people have issue with Christianity or Christians, but most people actually like Jesus.
Mhm.
Like even atheists. Like that's
Yeah.
that's kind of a good jump off point, maybe. So anyway,
Yeah,
what did you
absolutely.
what did you see in those, and maybe you can list a couple, but that there's something to be said for Jesus and the gospel he brings, that everybody sees a glimmer of hope in it, even if they want to deny his deity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, great question to end with. And as one who came from a different faith tradition that viewed Jesus in a different way, just as a prophet and a man, not as divine himself. Um, what I see as I look through the different religious systems and the lens through which he's actually shaped them, or they would adopt him in some way. So for the atheist, he's a moral teacher and a upstart who
Mm,
starts wanted to institute social change in an oppressive system. for the Buddhist. He's a bodhisattva, which is like someone who's wise and almost enlightened as much as the Buddha, or even just as much, depending on the brand of Buddhism you're looking at. For the Hindu, Jesus is almost like an incarnation of Vishnu, and they've actually said something along those lines. In fact, Gandhi was once fond of saying, I like their Christ. I'm not so sure I like their Christians.
Yeah.
And even for Muslims, he is a prophet. He's not more than a prophet, but he is a prophet who performs miracles and someone whose moral character we should aspire to be like. You see this over and over again. And that fact by itself should ought to tell us something about the centrality of this figure. It is not an exaggeration to say that he is the hub around which all other spokes seem to spin.
Mm.
Even when they don't try it. Really quickly, I think of movies where we accidentally tell the gospel story. If you watched I Am Legend, the Will Smith version of the earlier book, where you have a man who is immune to all the corrupting disease around him, and it's only by his blood that humanity can be saved. But in order to get his blood to humanity, he has to sacrifice himself. Hello, that's the gospel. This message of Jesus and his life and character is so powerful that we tell his story by accident. And so what I say about that is this. What I mean by that is this: is that so many people want a piece of Jesus. They want to claim Jesus as their own, which means that he's got an attraction. There's something about this man that we cannot get out of our minds. And to quote S.M. Lockridge, we can't get him out of our mind and we can't get him off of our hand. He's in our pens. He's in our writings. He's everywhere. But the problem is this, is that when here's the reason. The reason is because he does treat women the way he treats women. He does take a Samaritan and say, you can be included in the kingdom of God, even though you're hated amongst the Jews.
Yeah.
He does emulate everything we wish we were. Everything we wish we were, he is. And so he is attractive to everyone. But the danger is this, is that we can't co-opt Jesus to make him look like our version, our bodhisattva, or our incarnation. We got to take him on his own terms. We can't denude him of his cross, because it's the cross itself that actually says we're all equal in that we are all equally sinners. And we are all equal in that we are all equally offered redemption. That is the tremendous compliment that Jesus pays even to our vice, is that our vices make us equal, but the image of God in us makes us equal as well. And he's offered this to every single human being. And so if we say we love Jesus, but we rob him of his cross, and this is to borrow from Samuel Zwemer, if we say we love Jesus, but we rob him of his cross, it is to be like Judas. We betray the Son of Man with a kiss. We ought not do that. We ought not do that. And so I would urge us, let's look to him. Let's look to his character. Let's look to who he is and interpret the Bible in its proper context, but through the lens of the life of the one who everyone wants a piece of, but he offers the whole thing.
Amen. What a way to end. That's the moral of the story. That's the moral of this episode. That at the end of the day, please look to Jesus. Please don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. For those that watching, thank you for tuning in. And if you watched and disagreed with anything, rewatch it. No, I'm just playing. But seriously, get the book, because we're only scratching the tip. More Than a White Man's Religion by Abdu Murray. It's available everywhere on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible. Abdu, man, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I know we went a little longer, but I think I didn't want to brush some of these topics because it's so easy to soundbite people. So thank you for your time and your energy in tonight and in writing the book.
Well, thank you, Alex, for the opportunity and for the blessing it was to spend some time with you. It's always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to another time, I pray.
Thank you. And until next time, peace.